Hello everyone, this is Bob and Threadbare, and welcome back to Threadbare Reviews. Today's request comes once again from patron ASDFJKLSC, because they want me to take a look at James Cameron's old film, The Abyss. This movie's inclusion in the series is a bit arguable, since the aliens in it aren't necessarily from outer space, but it's close enough and it's got a psychological element, so onward we go. The story about the story. James Cameron has pretty much always been fascinated by deep-sea diving and the strange creatures that explorers find in the depths. He apparently wrote a short story about a deep-sea laboratory while he was in high school, and over the years he built up the story, changed some details, and was later reminded of it when he was making Aliens. At that point, Cameron and his producer, Gale Ann Hurd, decided to make The Abyss their next project. The two also married and then divorced before the film came out. A lot of the film shots are actively underwater, including many of the interior shots of the underwater facility. And to portray this realistically, Cameron had his crew build 2 water tanks in an abandoned nuclear power plant, including one which set the record at the time of the biggest water tank in the world, with a capacity of roughly 7.5 million gallons, or 28 million liters, and a depth of 55 feet, or 18 meters. The cast and crew all had to go through a week of diving training to get prepared for the filming. Said filming was hard on pretty much everybody. The constant underwater shots, technical problems, long work days, and the dangers of the production got on everybody's nerves and caused outbursts and mental breakdowns. And at this point, more than one actor refuses to talk about the movie. Fortunately, the film did pay off, getting a positive reaction from most critics and a box office return of $89.8 million against a budget that overran to around $47 million. It also got an Oscar for Best Visual Effects, and the animation of a liquid tentacle in the film would inspire Cameron to make the liquid metal T-1000 for Terminator 2. However, there's a bit of a controversy surrounding the final cut of The Abyss. In the DVD re-release, the abyssal aliens threaten to destroy the coastlines with massive tidal waves, but choose not to because of the power of love. In the theatrical release, the film cuts past the threat and just shows the power of love. There are rumors that the studio demanded this cut, but Cameron has said that he made the cut himself. It wasn't the anti-war message that was the issue. It was the fact that the special effects for that part of the film weren't done yet, and the film was already over budget and overdue. However, after Terminator 2 was a smash hit, Cameron was able to negotiate some extra funds to finish the tidal wave sequence, and in 1992 he released a special edition of The Abyss that adds 28 minutes to the runtime. That includes the extended end sequence and several scenes that lead up to it that were also cut since they would otherwise have led nowhere. For reference, the special edition cut is the version of the film that I'll be reviewing today, and the film still hasn't gotten an HD remaster, so I've had to use an old DVD with a 4:3 full screen format. The review. A United States nuclear sub crashes into the seafloor after an encounter with what's later called a non-terrestrial intelligence, or NTI. In response, the government appropriates a submersible oil rig since it was in the area, and it sends them and a team of Navy SEALs to investigate the wreckage. The government suspects the Russians were involved, and they have the SEALs recover a tactical nuke from the sub. But meanwhile, a hurricane causes the rig's support crane on the surface to snap off, and it almost drops them into the Puerto Rico Trench. As it is, several compartments flood, and not all of the crew survives. Tensions on the rig run high, partly because the oil riggers find out about the nuke, and partly because the SEAL team leader, Hiram Coffey, is suffering from a pressure-induced psychosis. The NTIs visit the rig several times as the crew wait for rescue, and while the rig staff is convinced that they mean no harm, Coffey goes crazy and decides to blow them up with the nuke. The rig staff and the rest of the SEALs work together to stop him, but when the nuke falls into the abyssal trench, the rig foreman Bud has to get into an experimental liquid breathing apparatus in order to go down and disarm it. He does so, with no hope of going back up, but the NTIs retrieve him and basically use news footage as a way to discuss whether to wipe humanity out or not. They eventually decide not to, using Bud as an example of why humanity is worth preserving, and then they save everyone on the oil rig for good measure. You can tell that most of the water effects are practical, because the underwater scenes are just as good today as they were in the 1980s. The crane sequence alone must have put the cast and crew through hell, but honestly, the end result was worth it. In terms of the realism on the screen, The Abyss holds up incredibly well. There are a few shots where you can tell that they used green screens, but the majority of the movie is done in camera. Another thing I like about the movie is that it doesn't have a traditional antagonist. Lieutenant Coffey acts as an antagonist, but he is explicitly suffering from a pressure-induced mental disorder, one that makes it impossible for him to think straight. And it is a real condition, by the way. The NTIs threaten to destroy humanity, or at least devastate our coastlands, but that's only because they don't know if they can safely share this planet with us. As such, they aren't really an antagonist so much as a science fiction version of God's final judgment upon this sinful Earth. But you don't really miss the lack of an antagonist, because the main conflict of this film is person versus nature, because the crew of the rig are trying to survive an underwater disaster. Now, the film does also have some weaknesses, like some overly sentimental moments, which tend to be a regular feature in James Cameron productions. There's a moment where the female lead, Dr. Lindsay Brigman, needs to be resuscitated, and when chest compressions and a defibrillator don't work, slapping her and shouting at her apparently do. Then there's the whole extended ending sequence, where we see all the sins of humanity, like war and nuclear weapons, but we get saved from annihilation because Bud said, "Love you, wife." I mean, we do have news reports and evidence of humans being good to each other and trying to preserve the environment, and realistically, the NTIs would have given much more weight to the larger body of evidence. Still, sentimentality aside, I'd say The Abyss is a film worth watching, although I can also see why it gets overshadowed by Cameron's other films like Terminator 2 and Titanic. It also doesn't help that it still doesn't have an HD remaster, probably because James Cameron is a perfectionist and would want to supervise the remastering himself. But if you do get a copy, or you happen to come across a screening, The Abyss is definitely worth your time. The analysis. When I said that the NTIs are passing God's judgment, I didn't just come up with a random analogy. There's a very solid theme of divine judgment within the movie, and it's reinforced by the film's imagery. The NTIs have an ethereal, angelic appearance to them, and one of the rig crew even calls them angels. Then there's the fact that the method of punishment that they threaten to use is a massive universal flood, one that they can perform because of their seemingly godlike power to control water. Even the film's title, The Abyss, has biblical implications. Now, while knowing the flood is the most obvious parallel to the film, the method of the NTI's judgment reminds me a bit more of another story from Genesis, the one about Sodom and Gomorrah. In it, the Lord tells Abraham that he will judge the two cities and spare them his wrath if he can find just 10 righteous people living there. He doesn't, and the two cities burn, but in this case, the NTIs find one righteous person, Bud, and so they spare the whole species. So while the asymmetrical judgment doesn't make much sense from a realism standpoint, it does make sense when you consider that the film is at least somewhat a religious allegory. The film is also an anti-war allegory, but that's not something you need me to tell you. In that sense, The Abyss has a lot in common with other 80s movies, like Starman. As such, I won't repeat here what I said in that review, but what I will say is that The Abyss is much more focused on themes like preserving life and cooperation, rather than diversity, which was Starman's main theme. The Abyss also minimizes the pro-war argument by having the one person in favor of it be a Navy SEAL going through a mental breakdown, which, in my opinion, is a better approach than having it be an Army general who's constantly wrong about everything, but people still listen to him for some reason. Now, I'm not saying that doesn't happen, of course. I'm just saying it's less believable. Thanks for joining me again for today's Threadbare review, and I hope I'll see you next time. Until then, please remember to like, share, and subscribe, and if you have a little extra money to spare, you can support me on Patreon. Link in the description.